Okay, so now let's get to our first talk today, becoming ethically aligned. How data scientists can take an ethic first approach. I would love to introduce our speaker, Katrina Ingram. Katrina is the founder and CEO of Ethically Aligned AI, a company focused on helping organizations to drive better outcomes in the design, development, and deployment of AI systems. She recently completed a master at the University of Alberta in research focused on artificial intelligence and applied ethics. Before returning to school, Katrina spent over a decade working in public broadcasting at both the CBC and CKUA radio. She combines her love of audio and interest in AI as the host of the podcast AI for Society Dialogues. With that, I will hand over the stage to Katrina.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to be here. As I look at the beautiful background of Vancouver, I'm missing the place because I'm originally from Vancouver. I'll just start with sharing a little bit about myself and how I got into this field of AI ethics. You've heard a tiny bit about my bio, and I started my career actually a long time ago back in the technology sector. In fact, someone mentioned that somebody was interning at SAP. I worked for the company that was a precursor to SAP called Crystal Decisions that was based in Vancouver, which has since now become SAP. So I started out as a tech marketer, and I decided to segue my career into broadcasting pretty early in that journey. I worked at the CBC in Vancouver for a little while, and then I wound up at this great place called CKUA Radio here in Alberta. And I spent the better part of a decade there in community radio. I really enjoyed it, loved the not-for-profit independent radio vibe. But in 2017, I decided that I wanted to try some different things with my career. I thought there was some next steps I wanted to take. I wasn't quite sure what those were. And so I decided to go back to school and pursue a master's in communications and technology. And that really is where my story starts to intersect with AI ethics. So I went to a talk in the fall of 2018, being given by a prominent AI researcher named Dr. Jonathan Schaefer. And Dr. Schaefer was talking about all of these stories about AI gone wrong, all these unintended consequences, bias and discrimination that was happening as a result. And I was really concerned at the end of his talk. And I went up to him and I said, "Who's working on these issues?" And he said, "Not enough people." And that really started my focus on this area. So I did a study with Dr. Schaefer that led to my capstone research project where I looked at how to apply ethics in the context of design. And that's some of what I'll talk about today. And so here's what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethical issues that are happening in AI. I'll talk specifically about the role of data. You're going to hear more about bias with our second speaker, and I'll touch briefly on this, but I'm going to set this up by talking about data. I'm also going to talk about the history of AI. I'm going to do this very quickly, but I think it's really important to understand how we landed at this moment. And I'll talk a bit about the role of power and power dynamics and how that plays into these ethical issues in artificial intelligence. And then lastly, to end on a more hopeful note, what do we do to address these issues? What's our path forward? How can we ensure that we aren't replicating these issues? What do we do to advance? So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is covered on my blog, ethicallyalignedai.com. If you're interested in learning more about any of these issues, I've written extensively about this since 2019. So there's more there. And I'll also be talking about other resources that I think are great that you can access to learn more. So that's what we're going to cover. So here we go. First off, many of you might have seen some of these headlines about AI gone wrong, issues of discrimination, issues around bias. This is something that I'm seeing increasingly covered in the media. In fact, today there was a news story about an insurance company called Lemonade. This is the first 100% AI insurance company using some questionable methods, let's say, to make some decisions about who should and should not get insurance. And I'll just share a personal story to set up how these issues play out. So I'm a podcast producer. That's part of what I do. And back in February, I've been producing a podcast on anti-Black racism. And in February, I was trying to set up just a quick little website for my client. I wanted to show them what this could look like. So I went to the software site Weebly.com to set up a free website. And I was looking for some pictures. I wanted some nice pictures of some Black people, maybe having a conversation. So I used the free picture feature that's encoded in Weebly. And I just typed into my search, Black people, and all kinds of horrible racist imagery came back at me. And as an AI researcher, ethics researcher, I knew exactly what was going on. But as a person, it just really hit me that in this moment, almost a year later, after George Floyd, after Black Lives Matter, after all the work that we're doing around equity, diversity, and inclusion, this was the kind of search result that was coming back at me, this very biased and racially biased search result. So that's one story of what happened to me personally. I also want to draw your attention to this other picture on the slide at the bottom. And it's a person in a white mask. That person is a researcher named Joy Buolamwini. Joy, while she was a master's student at MIT, was doing some research into facial recognition technology. And she found that the facial recognition software wasn't recognizing her face. And she wound up having to code her project in a white mask because the technology wasn't working for her. And so it's another example of how these technologies are released and they don't work for everyone. She's since gone on to publish her studies or her findings in a research study called Gender Shades. And also there's a movie called Coded Bias on Netflix, which is an excellent movie. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, it talks about these issues. So that's just setting up some of what's going on. And so really what I learned through this work is that technology is not neutral, that it has biases encoded in it. Sophia Noble has done a lot of work in this area. She has an excellent book called Algorithms of Oppression. And really what was happening for me when I was doing my search is exactly what happened for her when she was doing her research, as she was searching terms about Black women on Google and finding that it was leading to all of these kind of racially charged search results. And that's because technology is encoded with bias. I'm going to talk more about that when we talk about data. Another researcher in this field is Ruha Benjamin. She's a sociologist. She has a great book called Race After Technology. And again, she talks about sort of the social construction of how these technologies get created and why they contain biases and are not neutral. So these are some of the issues that we can find in this very big umbrella topic of AI ethics. So Rahat is going to talk more about bias, and that's certainly a very, very important issue and something that there are some tools and ways to mitigate that. But there's a lot of other things going on. There's issues around privacy. There's issues around human rights. There's issues around autonomy and just who gets to make decisions when automated systems are making decisions and potentially taking away from someone's right to make a decision. So this very, very big umbrella area is what I think about when I think about AI ethics. It encompasses a lot of different things. So in doing my research, how I like to frame these issues, how I like to think about this is in three buckets: data, math, and people. So when I think about where do we find ethical issues in the development of AI, I think about these three areas, and I actually think about them in terms of being concentric circles. So in the middle, I like to start with data because there's a concreteness about that, and people can kind of understand how data might be encoded with bias. And so there's things like how data is labeled, what data we have access to. My next slide is on data, so we're gonna talk more about that. But math is a little bit more controversial because we think of math as being very objective. We think 2 + 2, it's always 4. How can math be subjective? But what's happening is we build mathematical models. We build these representations that we then make decisions about things. And in building those models, there's a lot of human decision-making that takes place. There's a lot of feature engineering of how we're going to weight things and what things we're going to look at and what things we're not going to look at. And as data scientists, I think you know this, that there is that human decision-making that goes into it. And because of that, there is discrimination, bias, and other kind of things that can be encoded into the mathematical model itself. So that's kind of the next layer out. The last layer out is people. And people for me is sort of a big layer because it encompasses not only the people who build the technology, which is not a diverse group of people. Sadly, we're only looking at approximately 18% of data scientists being women. So we have, a really homogenous group, mostly of white and Asian men who are building this technology. Only 2% of Google's workforce is Black. So we're missing a lot of people in terms of who gets to build the technology in the first place. But the other piece of people is the companies who build the technology, the funding behind them, the agendas that are set, what gets built, what doesn't get built. All of that for me is the people layer, and that kind of speaks to the bigger society in which all of this is situated. So that's how I like to think about these issues. I'm going to talk for a bit about data, because data is such an important piece of this equation. They say that data is the new oil. It's the input for how these machines learn. And so it becomes really important. But what exactly is data? We're here working in data science. We work with data all the time, but what exactly is data? Well, data are representations. Data are abstractions. Data is there. Why does data exist? It exists to categorize something, to measure something. And so when you think about data, it exists for a specific purpose or a specific reason. This term counting is political, I think is really interesting. And to me, this really hit home with COVID. So when you think about the early days of COVID and who was counting cases of COVID and who wasn't, there were political agendas at play. Some countries were saying, hey, we don't have any COVID. We're choosing not to count COVID, so we don't have any COVID here. And of course, we've seen how this has played out, and it's resulted, there's some articles I've seen recently in kind of the undercounting of COVID cases, deaths of COVID. And so who gets to make those choices? Why are they making those choices? All of that is kind of infused in the data. We also have issues around incomplete, siloed, and biased data. And while we have lots of data in the world, sometimes we don't have the right data for our project. And I think as data scientists, you probably have understood this or encountered this in the course of your work. And so sometimes you grab the data that you do have and you try and make it work. Maybe there are proxies that you're using for other pieces of data that you don't have. And so there can be problems with that, with how that data is used. And when I think about data, I think about how it might be gathered for one purpose and used for another purpose. And that's what I mean by the secondary uses of data. And one of the data sets I like to point at that illustrates this is Twitter. So there are lots of social scientists, people in my area that take Twitter data sets and do all kinds of analysis with them, because Twitter is an easy data set to get your hands on. You don't really need clearances or too much permission. You can kind of get it and do all kinds of things with it. But when you're out there sharing stuff on social media, you're not necessarily thinking that some researcher is actually going to be analyzing this data for some other purpose, maybe to assess your mental health, for example. So that's a pretty, high stakes kind of purpose to look at. But that's really what's happening. We have all this data, we're using it for different purposes. And so what happens is this disconnect. We don't really know where the data came from, why it was necessarily originally collected. And then we use it for these other purposes. And some of that is driven by, what's available and what's easy to get our hands on. And that kind of leads into these other ethical issues around privacy and consent. So we have these consent policies. We've all seen them. We probably encounter them many times a day where it says, if you want to use XYZ service, you got to click here. There's this huge terms of reference thing that nobody reads because it's written in obscure language that we won't understand, and it's really, really long. And so we just click. And so is that really consent? It's a form of consent, I suppose. It covers kind of the legal bare minimum, but it's certainly far from what I would consider the gold standard of consent, which is where you really understand what the bargain is that you're entering into. So there's problems with that system. And then there's problems with privacy as well. We say that we're anonymizing data, we're making sure that people can't be re-identified, but there's lots of evidence to show that that doesn't always play out. So re-identification happens when you mash up different data sets. And in fact, with just a little bit of triangulation of a couple of different points, you can find out identities and re-identify people. So that's kind of the privacy consent equation that's playing out. And all of that sits in this bigger system, the system called surveillance capitalism. And Shoshana Zuboff wrote a great book about this. And really, this is the economic business model for all of this. So what that looks like is we get our hands on lots of data, we capture everything, we store it in the cloud for cheap, and then we mash things up and we reuse them as we find purposes for them, and we drive economic value off of that. And that's really the business model that underwrites a lot of the internet and underwrites a lot of these big companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook and so forth. So those are kind of the big issues. There's other issues with data itself, how it's labeled. And this is what I was seeing when I did my search, and it came back with a lot of racially charged imagery. How that data is labeled kind of drives the results you get from data. And in many cases, the people doing that labeling are in a gig economy. They're not paid very well. We outsource that work. It's not the sexy part of data science. It's kind of like data janitorial work that needs to get done. And the reality is that the way that we build AI systems right now, they're very data hungry. They need millions of training examples to work. The more, the better. And so that's why there's such a huge emphasis on data. So that's a lot. That's like a whirlwind tour of data. I could probably do a whole session just on data itself, but that's just to kind of set up the data side of the equation. And the last thing I'll say about data is increasingly what's happening with the Internet of Things is you have devices connected to other devices, connected to other devices that are seamlessly feeding data through each other and gathering it all up in ways that are really automated. So that's just something that's going to increase as we move forward. All right, so that's a little bit about what's going on. How did we get here? Why are we here? What is the context that brought us to this place? I'm going to give you the history of AI in North America in one slide. This is a super quick, super high level overview. But essentially, computing sciences itself was a pretty brand new field back in the 1940s, 1950s. And so in 1956, a group of men went to Dartmouth for a conference. They came out and they had coined the term artificial intelligence. And AI and most computer technologies at the time were being funded largely by military. It was to try and gain some advantages from a military standpoint. So when I talk about the academic military industrial complex, it's sort of the marrying of business, the military, and the academy in terms of driving this technology forward. So I think it's important to also look at who wasn't at the table. When you think about who was at the table, it was a group of highly educated white men. Who wasn't at the table? Women weren't at the table. Women got excluded from the field of computing fairly early. I think it's interesting to note that in the very early days of software, there were a lot of women working in the space, and there were a lot of human computers. So if you've ever seen the film Hidden Figures, it's about women whose job it was to create these computations that NASA would use to launch rockets. It's a really great film. But what happened over time is as that work became seen to be important, because in the early days of computing, it was all about the hardware. That's where the men were working, building the hardware. They thought that was the most important part. But as software became more important, men started to take over and push the women out of that field. And that's led, I think, to the numbers that we're seeing right now, which is still a fairly low representation of women. So women weren't at the table. Who else was not at the table? BIPOC communities were not at the table. There's a great story about an activist named Roy Wilkins, who was very big in the civil rights movement in America. He wrote an article in 1967 just kind of speculating, what would it look like if this technology that was being developed could be used in ways that would advance the civil rights movement? And of course, he was not invited to be at the table, and neither were any of the other marginalized communities. So then what happens after that is we go into what I call this overpromise, underdeliver hype cycle. And this happens for decades. So what happens is AI is going to solve everything. Oh, we are not able to do all the things we thought we were. The funding gets pulled. Wait a minute, we have a new breakthrough. And we kind of go through this for several decades. To be fair to AI, there were some breakthroughs that were happening, largely in the area of solving games. And so checkers, chess, and later poker were all areas that were kind of the early, let's call them wins in AI. And the university that I'm part of, the University of Alberta, played an important role in all of those. So we have that going on. And at the same time, for I would say the last 20 years or so, since about 2000, we've had this rise of surveillance capitalism as a business model. So since Google kind of came on board, this has been happening in the background. And then in 2012, something big happens on the processing side. We get GPUs, we get more processing power. And all of a sudden, we have all this data that we've been gathering. We have this new processing power. We have these algorithms that the AI field has been working on for decades. We put them all together, and all of a sudden, we're in this moment where we're having an AI renaissance. The money starts flowing in from venture capitalists. AI becomes the darling of the tech industry. But by about 2016, we start to see a few things that are giving us cause for concern. So this is when the movie Snowden launches. And prior to that, Edward Snowden had publicized what was going on, showing how the government was hoovering up a lot of personal data from citizens in the United States. And we also have the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So we start to see the downside, and we're still living through this moment. I mean, these things take years and decades to play out. We're still in this moment right now. We're trying to navigate what this all means as we move forward with AI, but hopefully in ways that are a little bit more cautious and taking into account some of these ethical issues. So that is a super quick overview of the history. I want to say, though, that this is not just about technology. Fundamentally, this is about people, and this is about power. This is a woman named Timnit Gebru. She was the AI ethics lead at Google up until December, when she was fired in a fairly public way. She was an outspoken critic of some of the things that were happening there. And so you can see what happens when power struggles play out. And this is still playing out at Google, and they've lost a lot of really good people, and I think have had a lot of reputational challenges in the past 5 or 6 months in particular, as this has played out in the media. So power is all about agenda setting. And when I think about who gets to set the agenda, I've mentioned what's known as GAFA, the Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon group. There's other big tech organizations that you could put into that slide as well. And when you think about agenda setting with AI, and you think about it, let's say, in the context of data sets, I pulled up this Prime Ministers of Canada data sets. And I don't know if you can read the source quote at the bottom, but this is from actually a kid's website. And the quote at the bottom says, "Why are most Canadian prime ministers old white men?" And I thought that just summed it all up. There's literally one woman on this slide. And can you imagine creating an AI that learned from a data set like that? This to me exemplifies why we have problems with some of these historical data sets. But it's not just, it doesn't just stop there. And I think it's important as AI ethics, people interested in AI ethics, to also question our own field. And when I think about the field of ethics itself and who sets the agenda there, we have more old white men. There are female philosophers. They don't necessarily get the credit that they deserve. Part of the work that I'm trying to do is bring more of a feminist lens to AI ethics itself as we grapple with these issues, because I think that's incredibly important, not just to look through the lens of what I consider the traditional Western European and primarily male canon. Okay, so that is a bit of a whirlwind tour about what's going on, how we got here, the role of data. What do we do about all this? Where do we go? What can we do? Well, I think about 3 things. I think about educating, I think about activating, and I think about remediating. So when it comes to educating, we can educate ourselves, we can educate others, we can help to create some active change, and we can also try and fix the things that aren't working. So here's a list of things that I think we can get behind. Education, for sure. I mean, I am still learning about this field. Even though I've done a master's degree in this area, there are new things happening all the time. There are more people who are doing great research. And so I have a list of resources for you around that. So I encourage you all to get educated and share your education with other people. So it's about educating yourself and others. I think that organizations need to have proper governance structures in place. And to me, this looks like things like AI ethics officers, algorithmic risk committees. In Europe, there's this role called the data protection officer that I think is a really important thing for us to consider as well. And I believe this all links to some of the work that's being done around equity, diversity, and inclusion, because I think it's really important that we have a diverse group of people making this technology, and also a diverse group of stakeholders who are weighing in on this technology. And so for me, that also looks like non-technical stakeholders. I'm not a data scientist. I don't have a technical background. I've been working in this field, and I think the work that social scientists and people in the humanities are doing is incredibly important. along with the work that data scientists are doing. So I think it's about creating these diverse, multidisciplinary teams of people to work on these problems. I believe regulation is coming to Canada. Right now, the GDPR is kind of like the gold standard in the world, and Europe is sort of setting the bar. But I think this is going to filter down to other countries. We're already seeing the movement in that direction. It hasn't happened yet, but I think that's where we're going. And at some point, I think that's going to lead to the need to audit AI systems. So third-party independent audits, much like we would audit our financial statements today, I think that's going to happen with AI systems at some point. How to do that is a very complex question and something that we will need to work out. And eventually, I think what we're going to need to see is a certification of some point so that consumers can know that this AI system that they're about to use is trustworthy, that somebody has looked at it, that they verified it for these issues, and that it's kind of passed the test. So I think that's where all of this is going. I have a lot of resources that I could recommend to you. This is kind of like the best of in one slide. There's an incredible amount of books. There's also academic papers. I've mostly listed books here that I think are really noteworthy. And I want to just point out one called Invisible Women. I read this a couple of months ago. It was shocking to me to see how little data there is gathered about women specifically to run things like clinical trials on common products like aspirin, for example. So that's not exactly AI, but it sort of leads into this idea that we don't necessarily have the right data all the time or representation in our data. So I wanted to point out that book for you. There's also great communities that you can join. Here in Canada, two that are really noteworthy: Montreal AI Ethics Institute has a community. There's a Slack channel. If you send them a message, you can get connected to the work that they are doing. And then there's a new group being formed called Encode Justice Canada that I'm working with. It's a group of young people aged 18 to 25-ish, and they're doing some really fantastic work around algorithmic justice. And then, of course, there's lots of different independent academics and activists who are working in this space. Many of them have written books and or papers, and so I would encourage you to check out their work as well. As for me, I also have some resources for you. I mentioned the blog already, and the podcast was mentioned at the top of the presentation, so I encourage you to check those out. There's an ethics toolkit that I sent to the organizers of this event, and that I believe will be shared with all the attendees. It is a list of 10 tools that I think would be really useful for people who are building the technology and to consider ethical issues. I also have a journal that's coming out this summer to help people reflect on these ethical issues. And I have some online courses that will be available in the fall. And I'm always happy to chat with you. I actually really look forward to the Q&A. I'm hoping there's some really great questions, and I encourage you to link in with me as well if you want to stay in touch. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm ending all of my presentations with this symbol of Jinn, which really to me is foundational to the work that I'm doing and to my company. And it's about uniting humanity and the benevolence in that. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see everybody and we can have a good Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Katrina. It is so it's very informational. I didn't have a lot of information about ethics in AI before, but this is touch on a lot of points. And I love that you mentioned about the diversity in the working group. As a data scientist, I try as much as I can to read about ethical issues in AI, but at the same time, there are people out there who work full time to research about this, like social scientists, etc. So we need to consult them to see if we have any blind spots. And yeah, it's just amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And how I'm seeing this is that because we have two speakers today, and you have can have different perspective. So Katrina, if you can take charge on this, but Rahab, if you have anything to add on, please feel free to do so. Yeah, so our first question is, in terms of ethics, what actions can you take to call out or counteract biases in the data?
Absolutely. Great question. So the first thing I think about is starting with better data, because then you don't need to, you need to have some confidence in what that data is. And so one of the things I discovered in my research, and my research was really focused on talking with PhD students who are building AI, is that they don't understand where their data came from in the first place. So this whole idea of data lineage, I think, becomes really important. It's sort of like they just grabbed a data set and now I'm gonna build a model and run with it. So I think number one is, do you know where your data came from? There is a really good tool. This is in the ethics toolkit called Data Sheets for Data Sets. And what this is just a bunch of questions about where was did this data come from? Who funded this study? Who collected it? Under what conditions? What's in the data set? So I think number one is like start with better quality ingredients. Now, the bias question I think is interesting, and I think there are definitely statistical ways at getting at that, which I'm not the best person to ask about that. And I'm going to leave that for Rahaf to go into because I think she's going to cover some of that in her presentation. But I think that's another thing that can happen. So you can do that. And then the last piece is, when you're looking at the outcomes of what's happening, making sure that you're consulting a diverse range of stakeholders. And I think consulting a diverse range of stakeholders throughout a process is really important, starting with the purpose of why am I even doing this? And does this work for the people who will be impacted by it? And then all the way through that process. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind.
Thank you so much. Rahab, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just say that it's a good question. I'm actually going to cover this in one chunk of the presentation. Like I'm going to be presenting different ways to mitigate bias. So yeah, that's a good question.
Awesome. Cool. So stay tuned for Rahab's presentation. Mark this as answer. Okay. Second question. Do you think an ethics test should be required for data scientists, or an ethics officer is necessary for a company?
Yes, absolutely. So ethics test. Okay, so the thing about ethics that I need to explain is it's not black and white. I mean, if it was as simple as yes or no or this or that, I mean, yes, there is right and wrong, but there's contextual situations as well. And so I like to talk about ethical choice. And what ethics is all about is thinking through why those choices are being made, really thinking through that. And so for me, it's not, I wouldn't frame it as a test per se, but I am building educational content for people. And I think everybody should have an education and background. And then it's about being able to take that learning and apply it within the context of whatever you're working on. And I like to think of it as building the capacity for ethical thinking, if that makes sense. So I think I push back on framing it as a test. And I think that ethics officers are necessary, but my caveat for that is that what can happen sometimes is people can say, oh, well, we have an ethics officer and now that's their problem. So I've washed my hands of all this ethical stuff and they're going to figure it out. That is not the role of an ethics officer. So an ethics officer is necessary to lead the charge and kind of convene and bring together the conversation, but you shouldn't offload your ethics to the ethics officer. So yes, I think it's necessary, but I don't think it's just, you put them in place and you check box it. So those are my thoughts on that.
This one is interesting. I would want to know all secrets to become a great ethical data scientist.
Well, okay, what can I say about that? So I will, maybe you guys can see me, I think. I'm just going to hold something up that I've been working on that I'm really, this is the book that I mentioned in my presentation. So one of the things I think is really important is to reflect on like yourself, your values, what you want to see in the world. I think that's step one. And that's what this reflections journal is all about. So I've created this to help people do that within the context of AI ethics. So I think it's about, figuring out who you are, how you want to show up in the world and what that's going to look like. And that's going to help drive choices. It's going to drive choices like what company will I work for or won't I work for? Or if you're running your own company, whose funding will I take or won't I take? Or if you're a researcher, same question. And those to me are, the big ethical questions about becoming a great ethical data scientist. because those are foundational questions about what you will and won't stand for in this world. And I think it starts there.
So next one, how to get started in working AI ethics.
So I think it depends on what role or where you see yourself playing a role in this space. So as a data scientist, you're so well positioned you can get started today. I think it's about understanding what the issues are, and there is that reading list to get started. There's no limit on the resources that are out there. I also would encourage you to connect with other people, especially if you're in an organization where maybe you're the lone voice who feels this is important. Before the talk, Rahaf and I were just saying that we felt there's not enough people that care about these issues yet, and we couldn't understand why, because it's such important work in our opinion. And so I think connecting to a community or maybe even building that community within this group here at Women in Vancouver Data Science is a great way to kind of feel connected. And then just start questioning. I think a lot of it is about thinking critically about the work that you're doing, and you can ask a basic question like, who is this working for and who is this not working for? If I build this product, who might this not work for? Or what if bad actors got a hold of my product? What might happen? What might the consequences be? Start asking some of those questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so next one, what does ethics in AI mean for targeted marketing companies? I remember like before we started this session, I played some music, and Zoom was commenting that, because of recommendation system, right? So like we tend to listen to the same categories, and it's hard to expand our view. But it's the same for other marketing companies as well, like advertisement, for example. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, I trained as a marketer. That is my original background. I'm a marketer. I did my degree at SFU many years ago in business, and I came out. And I always felt really conflicted about being a marketer, because as a marketer, your ultimate dream is that you have enough data to perfectly target the one person that you're trying to reach and get them to buy your product, whatever that is. And so in some ways, we're living in a marketing utopia right now with all of this data. And of course, now I'm on the other side of this equation, trying to help advance the work of privacy and all of these other things. And so in a way, I find it kind of comical in an ironic way about how my career has landed. And so what does ethics mean for a targeted marketing company? I think as a marketing company, your job is to sell a product. Let's just be clear about that. And so are you going to do that in ways that are transparent, or are you going to do that in ways that are sneaky, right? And I think it's about being transparent and being honest about what you're trying to do. And the best work that you can do as a marketer is when you connect a product to someone who actually really wants to buy that product. That is the best thing that you can do as a marketer. And in the cases when you're doing that, you are doing a really high value added service. And so I think about holding myself to that standard as a marketer. Recommendation systems, I think, are tricky because they do lead you into these spirals in cases where, and in some cases, those are good. Like sometimes I get recommended things, I think, yeah, I'm really glad I heard about this. In other cases, you feel like you're not expanding yourself. I think then there needs to also be this sort of sense of, are we relying too much on those systems? What could we do differently as a marketing firm? How could we approach this in ways that give people better choices or more choices or a choice? So I think as marketers, you can hold yourself to that higher standard as well, and even as a marketing company.
So next one, how do we measure or quantify the ethical issues with data? More like pitch it to a company with a demo of their data.
Yeah, this is kind of tricky, and I've thought about this a lot, because when I'm pitching my own services, companies want to know, well, how much risk is that? Is that like lots of risk? Is it little? Or is it we're going to wind up in $1 million lawsuit, or is it just immaterial? They call it in business terms. And so I think it's challenging because I think in some cases we haven't necessarily seen enough of these lawsuits and other cases come to bear. Some things that come to mind are positioning this, the way I guess to position it from a business standpoint is you can talk about reputational risk. Reputational risk is big. You're going to lose customers and you're going to lose brand, and companies care about those things. How much of that you're going to lose, I think it depends on how big a disaster it is that you've released into the world. So there's that. If you're found to be not in compliance or offside, or you do get sued, then of course there is going to be legal consequences around that that result in financial consequences. Again, how much will depend on the magnitude of the situation. And so I think it's tough to put exact metrics on it, because I do think it's contextual. But I think when you're pitching to a company, you can tell them about how these things lead to business risk. And that seems to be a way that resonates with organizations.
Mhm. Yeah. I think for these questions, in terms of like measure and quantifying like biases within our model, maybe Rahaf will cover that later. But I remember listening to a podcast that Rahaf was a part of. Yeah, you mentioned something about like using the model itself to reflect the biases that we see. Do you have anything to add to this question?
Yeah, so I love the question, because I'm like, oh, okay, now it's spoiled. Like all my presentation is being asked about. But really, like measuring bias is something that is very critical. And when we like, as Has said, like when we try to measure bias in a technical term, I mean, it's really good to have it in numbers, because we can make it more subjective. Right now, we don't have it that subjective, but we can do it. And then we can bring those results back to the society, and the society says, okay, we can use this number to solve our societal issue. And then they will notice that the numbers were wrong, and then they will send it back to the tech people, and it will keep bouncing back and forth. So a measurement is really something that is not good only in that tech, or like just measuring data, but it's also like one step to solve ethical issues in our societies. So that's a very important thing that we have to answer.
Our next question, in Colin Breyer's book, Working Backwards, he suggests that one solution to hire more minority and increase diversity is to always give those underrepresented groups an interview. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not familiar with that particular book, but it sounds very interesting. I think that, yes, I've been in situations where you're hiring for a role and you want to make sure that you're interviewing a diverse pool of candidates, and you can say to the hiring team, the hiring manager, the recruiter, I want to make sure I see X amount of women, X amount of minorities, whatever that is going to be. I think that is one thing, but then there's other pieces of this equation. So there's, where you post a job, who sees that job posting can drive the pipeline. One of the pushbacks I hear is, oh, well, no women applied for this job, so unfortunately we weren't able to interview any of them. Those are things that I would challenge in terms of how you're even advertising a job. And algorithms are implicated in this, because think about how we search for jobs today. Most of us probably would hop on Indeed, and what I see is going to be different than what you see, what gets served up to me versus you, based on our search histories and all of that. So I think that's part of it. And then the next piece is, how the hiring process is conducted. In some cases, there are algorithms that are doing the actual recruitment itself and doing the interview. Companies like HireVue that are using kind of a video-based assessment of you. So who makes it through all of those hoops, I think, is another piece. And then the last piece is retention. So do you have a culture that is friendly towards women, minorities, and a diverse range of people? Because even if that person makes it through all of those things and they land in an unfriendly environment, you will not retain them. And so I think it's a culmination of all of that to really kind of move the needle in a way that is productive.
Next one, do you think an ethics review board for academic research would be beneficial to help train more ethically oriented professionals?
I do, but I'll also share that there are limitations with how ethics review boards are are kind of set up in academia. And this is what I found in my own research. So there are ethics review boards, which are great. They're fairly rigorous, and I've helped many professors write ethics applications. And of course, I did my own ethics application. But you're actually exempted from writing an ethics application if you're using secondary data sets that have been what they call pre-cleared. And this is where I found out that most of the students that I talked to in my study, because they were computer scientists, they were all using this so-called pre-cleared data. And ethics review boards do not review that. So all of a sudden, you don't even have to do an ethics review board process for your study at all, which I was a little shocked to find that out. And so I think there's a gap right now in REBs and how they're actually implemented. And there are some researchers in the States that are looking at this and trying to change this notion of an ethics review board. I think the general thinking is that, oh, well, somebody's already looked at that data. Well, they have maybe, but for a totally different purpose than what this new study is. And so I think having some kind of a review process makes sense, but it needs to also sort of address this area of secondary data sets.
Yeah. Rahab, do you have anything to add on this? Because I know that you're a part of ethics considerations working group as well.
Yeah, I mean, the ethics review for like academic research, it's a process that I've been through, and it was very painful. And I would agree with Katrina, like it's not always that something that would capture everything, but a review board for stuff other than research are very important, and especially if it was a third party that is doing the review, not somebody who is involved in the company or who is part of the company. So yeah, it's definitely something that is going to help like drive the ethics values of the team working on the research.
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, we have 3 more minutes. Mark this. So based on what you mentioned previously about biased data sets, would we expect clinical trials, for example, to state if they had a data set that was biased for sex or gender or ethnically background?
Okay, yeah, would we expect them to state that? So basically, I think you're asking about, should there be more transparency potentially in all of this clinical trial data? I think there should be, and perhaps there is to a certain degree, but what tends to happen though is the data still gets used that's collected, and products come to market anyways. A good example of that is seatbelts and crash test dummies. So the way a crash test dummy is designed is for what they call the average male. They've never designed one for even the average female up until recently. There's a new one that came out, I think, in the latter part of between 2010 and 2020. I'm not sure of the exact year, but think about it. Think how long we've had seatbelts and crash test dummies and car testing, decades and decades. And it was based on trials that were done on this dummy that was built on the average male. And it's that kind of thing where, you don't really even think about it until you stop and actually dig into it, as the person who wrote this book did. And look at that. Same with pain medication. It's sort of tested on clinical data around, men and the average male. So I think, like, should we expect there to be more transparency? I think we should. Whether we will see that or not, I'm not sure. I think that's kind of an open question.